Alright guys, welcome to RC Mojo. A bit more 3Racing ExReal again this week, and we very nearly got the gearbox together last time, and since it looks like we've only got a couple of pages to do, and there's a bit of repetition we can skip through, I think we'll maybe definitely get it in and mounted. Probably. Right, on to page 7. As usual with this kit, we need loads of bits. First we've got two 5x7x0.3 shims, two 9.8mm pins, and don't forget to measure them just in case, two M3x8s, two M3x6 countersunk, two M3x8 countersunk, two M4 screw pins, two of what they call centre rollers, two transmission outer shafts, they're the outers of the joints rather than the shaft though, two transmission swing shafts, these ones are the inner bits of the joints, two transmission outer tubes, I suppose that description's okay. Lastly, we need two of the actual shafts. One is a 29.5mm and the other one's 34. You can work out which is which, but it's quicker just to measure them. The first job is to attach the inner part of the joints to the shafts. The metal joints key into the plastic quite nicely, and they use an M3x8 countersunk screw to hold them in. Here I broke one of the golden rules. I assembled the shaft first without doing a dry fit. I went straight in with a thread lock, and more often than not you'll actually get away with it, but this time with the screw bottomed out there's loads of slop, and that's no good. I tried one of the M3x6 countersunk screws, since while they're listed on the left they're not actually used in the assembly diagrams, but even with the shorter screws there was still a little bit of slop. The screws aren't going to be seeing all that much force, they're only there to stop the joint from falling out. The majority of the force is going to be rotational. So a quick fix is to grind a millimetre or so off the end of the screw. Once done and reassembled, the shaft and joint feel very solid with no slop. Next they want us to unite the two halves of the gearbox. Make sure it all wants to go together smoothly before greasing things up. This was when I noticed that the shims I mentioned in the previous videos weren't going to work. So they were all removed before the final assembly. The two gears on the motor side of the gearbox need to get greased up. A nice coat all the way round will do the job. It's going to get spread out once the gearbox gets spun up. The two halves are held together with three M3x8s, and as usual they don't need to be done up with all the strength you can muster, they just need to be snug. With the gearbox together we can adjust the position of the pinion on the motor. Annoyingly, I either didn't film it or it's been lost to the SD card gods. You need to make sure the pinion doesn't catch on the spur gear, which is now properly held in place. Very roughly, the stock pinion ended up flush with the end of the stock motor shaft. Don't take my word for it though, double check for yourself during the build. Drive shafts next, and they're quite easy to put together, just a bit fiddly. First though, we need to slide one of the thin shims on the output from the transfer box. Okay, starting with the drive shaft, we need to slide in one of the centre rollers and line up its hole with the slot. Next, the outer cup goes over the top and we can press in one of the pins. As long as the hole in the roller is lined up, it should go together quite smoothly. If the pin gets hung up, take it apart again and readjust the roller. Over that little assembly, we can fit one of the plastic covers and slide the whole lot onto the transfer box output. Install one of the screw pins and job's done. The other shaft is exactly the same, shim and all. Just make sure the long shaft is on the motor side, the front, and the short shaft is on the rear. That just leaves the two unused countersunk screws. They don't have a place to go on this page, but you never know, they might be needed somewhere later, so I'll put them in a nice safe pot just in case. Okay, page 8 now, and we're mounting the gearbox to the chassis. There's not too many parts for this page. All we need is 4 M3x10 countersunk and 4 M3x10 button heads. We seem to be one short though. There's a couple of M3x8s going spare, but no more 10s. Luckily, I've got a bag of the right size screws that I can take one from. Along with the screws, we're also going to need 4 plastic spacers from one of the parts trees. Fitting the gearbox is fairly straightforward. The gearbox itself uses the spacers between the chassis rails and the mounts, but trying to hold it all in place without dropping anything could be a bit of a pain. Instead, we'll start with the transfer box, partially installing the 4 countersunk screws so the assembly can still move around, but be stable enough to make fitting the spacers much easier. The button head screws are threaded into the aluminium mounts on the gearbox, so before we fit them we need to apply a little bit of thread lock in all the holes. We only need a little bit in the threads. Next we can pop the screws through the appropriate holes in the chassis rails with the spacers. They're going to be easy to knock off, but as long as you're careful they should stay on long enough to start the screws in the threads. The idea is to get all the screws loosely installed, gradually doing them up until they're just bottomed out but not tight, just so the parts are nicely in contact. Then nip up the transfer box screws. As usual, they only need to be done up so they're nice and snug and not crazy tight. Now the last step is to tighten up the gearbox screws. We go through all that because there's a certain amount of movement in the parts. It would be fairly easy to fit the gearbox so it's ever so slightly twisted, making the shafts lean on the bearing, shortening their useful life. And that's the gearbox complete. It all spins very smoothly and it feels nice and solid. We'll have to wait to see how it actually runs though. There's a few more bits to add before it's going to be rolling. Next time we're on to bag 3, which looks to contain the front axle. For now, that's going to be it for this week, so as always, thanks for watching, like if you liked, subscribe if you haven't, and leave a comment if there's something on your mind. Bye guys!